Hi, and welcome to Axelbank Reports History and Today, conversations with America's top nonfiction authors and why their books matter right now. I'm Evan Axelbank, and today we're going to speak with Caroline Hallemann, the author of The Kennedys and the Windsors, the story of two dynasties, one born and one made. This is her first book. She is the digital director for Town and Country magazine. Caroline, thanks so much for being here.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm
I want to,
excited to talk.
yeah, it's fun. I want to invite our listeners to our Patreon page to ask for your support in keeping the show going. Go to patreon.com/AxelbankHistory. We will donate part of your contributions to a charity for children's literacy. And AxelbankHistory.com is designed by Nikki Rideout of Ellie Claire Designs. It has our most recent episodes, our featured episodes, and a link to that Patreon page. So check out Nikki's work. America, we have our royal family. It's not the Trumps, it's not the Bushes, it's not the Clintons, it's not the Adamses, it's not the Kardashians, and it's not the Rockefellers. It's the Kennedys, of course. A mayor, a bootlegger, a president, a senator, a next generation that has tried all sorts of things to varying degrees of success and helpfulness to try to continue their reputation as America's royal family. And then in England, the key difference there is that there isn't even a discussion about who the most royal family is. They are the royal family. So let's start with them. Let's start with the Windsors. In terms of the beginning of your story, when the Kennedys and the Windsors start to interact, what made the Windsors the family that everybody in England looked to? What made the Windsors the Windsors?
So, the beginning of my story is really kind of the beginning of the interactions between these two families. So, you're looking at Joe Kennedy Sr., and he was the ambassador to the UK prior to World War II. And so, he is interacting with the royal family kind of shortly after the abdication. So, um, that was when King Edward VIII abdicated in order to marry Wallis Simpson. And so that thrust onto the throne, someone who was never meant to be king. So that's King George VI. That's Queen Elizabeth, the late Queen Elizabeth's father. And he is someone who, like I said, it was not on his destiny to be on the throne. That was not something he thought would happen. He thought that would always be his older brother's path. And so he was an unlikely king. But really kind of in the years that followed right there, right after that, those first interactions with Joe Kennedy, you see the Windsors kind of really prove their mettle and give a reason for the monarchy in the UK, in that they are the constant during World War II. They are bringing the people together. They are kind of showcasing, the bravery and the power and the pride of the UK during World War II.
Are they worldwide celebrities in the way that they are now? Or was their celebrity confined either to Europe or even to their own country?
I think that the concept of celebrity in the modern day is so different than it was then. I think in part because of the of how often we are able to see these people online and things like that. It's just a totally different kind of popular culture concept. But yes, they were famous. They were famous throughout the world, primarily famous in their country, though.
How far can we go back with the Kennedys? And can we determine maybe not who the first person was in their clan to outreach the station that they were born into, but at what point does this family start striving for something more than just being a regular old family from Ireland?
Sure. Well, you think about going through Rose's line, then I think you think about so Rose was JFK's mother, and you think about her father, who was the mayor of Boston. And that was really she wrote in her memoirs that Boston, when she was growing up, was two separate societies. So there were the kind of Boston Brahmins, so to speak, the descendants of the original colonists, and those were mostly Protestant, mostly with ties back to England. And then there were the Irish Catholics, and the way that the Irish Catholics gained power and prestige and prominence was through politics. And so her father was kind of the first example of that, Honey Fitz. He was a really eccentric man who was the mayor of Boston. And you can see direct ties there to the rest of the family and kind of that ambition and wanting to press kind of the family forward.
You say that it had never been explored as to how the two, until now, as to how the two family stories are intertwined. Before we get into the specifics of that, when and how did you realize that these two stories could be told as one, just given the obvious differences in geography, but also in the difference in how they attained their royal status?
Yeah, well, it goes back to, as you mentioned kind of at the start, I am also the digital director at Town and Country. So I have covered both of these families for over a decade now. And in 2022, Prince William was bringing his Earthshot Prize to Boston, which, for those who don't know, Prince William's Earthshot Prize is his big environmental initiative. It was kind of his first step toward becoming what he calls like a global statesman. So he wanted to bring this conservation initiative to the world stage. They'd had one event in London, and kind of step two was in Boston. And he had previously mentioned that the Kennedy moonshot, the idea that, that Kennedy set forth that we were going to put a man on the moon in a decade and bring him home, had been his inspiration for Earthshot. But when they were kind of gearing up to go to Boston in 2022, he was really leaning into that concept. And I actually covered that visit on the ground. He met multiple times with Caroline Kennedy.
So
He
you were
toured
there. Yeah.
yes, so I was
Yeah.
there. He toured the JFK Library with not only Caroline, but Jack Schlossberg and Tatiana Schlossberg. And, it was just really leaning into the Kennedy of it all. And I just thought that was really interesting of this idea of America's royal family, and then, but it was really the British royal family kind of leaning on this idea and using this iconography and this language to appeal to Americans, really, and to kind of use it as a PR framing. And I just thought that was so interesting. And then a week later, Prince Harry had his own kind of interaction with a separate branch of the Kennedy family. Both of the Sussexes received the Ripple of Hope Award from the Robert F. Kennedy Human Rights Organization. And I thought that was interesting. And then I just kind of couldn't get the idea out of my head. I was like, that's interesting. And I had known about, Joe Kennedy Sr. prior to World War II being the ambassador to the UK. I had known about, the kind of famous 1961 meeting when JFK and Jackie went to Buckingham Palace. Um, and so I thought, wow, that would be like a really interesting book to read. Like I would love to like know about these two families and like whether there was some like more interactions and things like that. And so I kind of kept poking around and didn't find, what I was looking for. And so that's kind of the beginnings of, well, maybe I should write it.
Lucky you, you had 5 years
Right,
of work ahead of you.
right.
You say that Shakespeare knew this one fact. There's just
Mm,
something about family drama
yeah.
that keeps us coming back for more. Do
Hmm.
you think that's a self-reflective um, principle, or is it like a voyeuristic thing? What makes us so interested in watching other people's drama?
Gosh, I think it's probably both. I think the idea of why the Kennedys continue to kind of hold this position in American, kind of the American cultural identity and the American life, I think is at least in part because of the drama of it all. More recently, family drama has only come into that, but I think people want to relate to the people that are celebrities to them. And I think that, most people can identify with family drama on a small scale, and then family drama on a large scale, I think is appealing.
Yeah, it is interesting to watch, I guess. I find it hard sometimes though to see the difficulties and know that there actually is a family with real mothers and real fathers and all that. How have these two families navigated the private and public aspects of their lives? Do they truly have private lives, as best you can tell?
I think so. I think they do, but I think they also have kind of alongside that, enormous expectations from the public eye. I think about Caroline Kennedy a lot when thinking about this and how she has, in some ways, managed to have a very private life. She is a very, she's a very known entity. She is someone who most people in America recognize the name, if not the face as well. But she's not on the cover of a tabloid every day. That is something she has carved out for herself. And I would imagine that was a lot of work. But at the same time, I have thought a lot about public grief in writing this book because I think that is one of the parallels between the two families. And I think that even though Caroline is a relatively private person when speaking about kind of this family and their history, and that her daughter Tatiana was a very private person when thinking about this family and their history. There were photographs of Caroline leaving the church after her daughter's funeral, and that was unavoidable. And I think so, yes, I think, in terms of the Kennedys, many of them have private lives, but they still kind of have at the back of their mind the idea that the worst tragedy of their life will still be public knowledge. And that I think is a piece of it. That's very different from the Windsors. I think if you are, one of the most famous, the working royals, the people at the highest kind of like end of the line of succession, things like that, like you have a private life and then you have a very public life, and you kind of can't get away from that.
The only way to get to the top of American political life, at least, is to get the most votes. And so
Mhm.
far, despite all the yapping, only one Kennedy has managed to do that. The Windsors, though, are lucky enough to inherit the top
Mhm.
of the sort of mountain in British life. What have you noticed about the way they have protected that institution that has made it so that while some in England might kind of scorn at the attention that they get and that it's not necessarily a part of how the government operates on a daily basis, what have you noticed about the way they have protected that little role for themselves in England as it has become one of the world's foremost democracies?
I think I think it's a lot about public relations and being present. I think that the British royal family occupies a particular space in British life. I think that they are seen often, and I think that is core to kind of why they continue to hold this position. That consistency is so essential for them. I think that's why Queen Elizabeth had such an impact, and I think that's why there is a bit more of a question related to kind of the longevity of the monarchy following her death. She represented the through line through history for lived history for most people when she passed away. She was there for World War II. She was there throughout the 80s. She was there, and she was still there until she passed away. And I think she was seen as not just the queen of the United Kingdom, she was seen as like the queen broadly. Like when you said the queen, you knew it was her.
Right,
There
right,
wasn't a question there.
right, right.
But I do think, I think in a post Queen Elizabeth world, in a post kind of Harry and Meghan moving away to California, I think the the British royals kind of they have a youth and a vitality problem that they need to kind of reckon with. I think, they need to be seen as they need to be seen doing good works. And I think they have fewer and fewer people who are able to do that on a regular basis.
My sister has a friend who it's either my sister or my it's either my sister's friend or my sister's friend's sister, but either way, they were living in England
Mm,
And while they were living there, there's a video. This was back when videos first started to be like a thing that you just sent all over the place within like 3 seconds. But she had a video of like an elevator door, and everybody was like waiting for this elevator door to open, and the elevator door opens, and the Queen walks out.
mm.
And I remember her voice was like the Queen, and everyone's like the Queen. And it was like a 5 second thing. She walked past everybody, and that was it. It would have been different if it was even the president or
Mhm.
the governor of New York or something like that. It's just a different feel. Why do you think the British have this feeling, this warm feeling towards their queen or king, even though they're not necessarily running things on a daily basis?
Yeah, they're absolutely not running things on a daily basis. I think that's part of it. I think
They're not caught in the muck of government, in other
right.
words. Yeah.
I think again it kind of goes down to that constant and the idea of kind of pride in the UK that's not tied to politics, I think is an interesting concept. We don't, I was thinking about this a bit during the Olympics. It's like the United States doesn't have that except as it relates to sports. Most of our kind of national allegiance at this point is tied in some way to being political. And I think the fact that the British royals are, decidedly not so, I think that allows for people to kind of look at them fondly. But I think, and I think they are just such a core part of the UK's identity. That is also why it kind of remains. But absolutely, there are critics of them as well. Like it's not everyone in the UK who just thinks we should continue on in this way.
And do they get tax money? Explain how that works. How do they keep their little kingdom going there of, I'm guessing, more than one house and more than one car?
Absolutely,
They're
absolutely.
a two-car house. Yeah.
They receive funding from kind of from the government, and that funds the way that they, the way it funds their funds the way that they live and the way that they work. And that is, absolutely something that should be, that people should know.
Let's talk about how you put this all together. What sources did you use, and what sorts of things and archives did you have to plumb in order to put this story together?
Yeah, so it's not I'm very aware of the fact that both of these families, much has been written about them. And so I came into this and I thought, okay, I have to like provide something new. There has to be something new here. And so I wanted to do a lot of research, and three institutions kind of stick out, but there were several others. I went to the UK and I researched in the Royal Archives, which was really interesting, fantastic experience. They're at Windsor Castle. The Kew Archives in London as well offered some really great insight into kind of how the British people and how the UK government operated in two particular instances. The first was when JFK and Jackie went to Buckingham Palace in 1961, what kind of was that planning like? What did that operation look like? What was kind of the excitement and interest there? And what were those communications like? I found that to be really interesting. And then, and what was their reaction following Kennedy's death? Because so Prince Philip served as kind of the representative of the Queen at President Kennedy's death, and there was a delegation from the UK. And I knew that, President Kennedy's death has been documented, memorialized. That story has been told so many ways. And so I wanted to try and tell it from kind of the perspective of that UK delegation.
Which country did you think was more open and easier to study?
I think both of these families are very precious with their legacies. And so there were a lot of things I also went to the JFK Library to do research, which was again a fantastic experience, um, but it is not without things that are redacted still. And the same goes for um, the Royal Archives in the reign of Queen Elizabeth. That is not something that is easily accessible even to researchers. And I just think that there is a lot of, um, these legacies are important and they're kind of doling out that information over time. And but I would say that's a good question. Who was easier to research? Which country? Um, I just think that perhaps Kennedy researchers, not all of them have gone to the UK. So I found that to be like more interesting
Mhm.
things that I hadn't seen before. Some different perspectives, some different letters from Jackie that I'd never seen published, things like that.
Mm. What did you have tons of books that you were horsing around through and going through on a, minute by minute basis to try to fill in the gaps?
Absolutely. Like I said, I mean, there are plenty of books written about these both of these families, and there are plenty of kind of firsthand memoirs. I think those were what I found to be particularly helpful, especially about the 90s. And those were the people who were, also willing to speak with me and kind of elaborate as well. And what I'm referencing is, people who knew and worked with John F. Kennedy Jr. And Carolyn Bessette, their close friends, and also people kind of who knew and worked with Princess Diana. That I found to be that kind of time period the most open on both sides of the pond. Of course, because kind of those parties have all passed away. I think people feel like they can speak a bit more freely.
Were you able to find decent and rewarding interviews? Was that something that you were trying to do, or have these people been dead for too long to really have contemporaries who can talk, even talk a little bit eloquently about what they'd been through with them?
Yeah, again, my most fruitful interviews, I would say, are from people who kind of knew the generation, like John F. Kennedy Jr. and Carolyn and Princess Diana, and onward toward the modern day, looking back at people kind of who knew people during the Kennedy administration in the 1960s. That was, most of those people
Hmm.
either have passed on or kind of were not able to speak with me. But I will say that the John F. Kennedy Library has a fantastic oral history project, which that was something that I spent a lot of time looking at.
I'm curious about how you got started covering the Royals. Talk a little bit about your time at Town and Country, and how's the magazine business?
Yeah. So I went to work at Town and Country almost exactly 10 years ago, so in 2016. And we were really, so I was brought on by Elizabeth Angel, who's a fantastic editor, and we were tasked with kind of bringing the website then into the daily news grind. At that point, they weren't publishing kind of news day to day. And a really core part of what news means for Town and Country is covering the royals, because in part they do something almost every day. There is a story almost every day, and so that was really kind of how I, um, you know, got interested in the family and their kind of goings on. And I covered them as a news writer and then as the news director for the site kind of really all the way through, Harry and Meghan's wedding. That was a really kind of interesting time for us, and then into the modern day. And now I run the site, so I write a little bit less in the day to day, but I oversee the coverage. And in terms of the magazine business, gosh, that's a great question. You tell me. No, but I think I love working at Town and Country because we're a magazine with a very particular point of view. We're with a very particular perspective. And I think kind of that brand voice, brand identity standing out from kind of the rest, whether that's kind of AI or other publications, and knowing, okay, that's a Town and Country story, that's not a Town and Country story. I think that's only going to become more important.
How did you manage to take on both jobs, keeping the site going and writing a book, which many of the authors we have on say is the biggest bear you can challenge in the wild?
I look back on this and I think maybe that wasn't the best idea. I also have a young child, so that was another piece of it. It was really a struggle, but at the same time, like, I can't imagine having done it any other way. My I was kind of taking vacations to go on research trips, and I was doing tons of work on the weekends and all of that. And at the same time, it was helpful because working on a daily news website means that I am familiar with the daily news and the latest on both of these families, which, just continues to go on every day. There's a new story.
I want to go into some of the specifics of some of these
Sure.
intertwining events.
Yeah.
Joseph P. Kennedy in England,
Hmm.
he's the ambassador for FDR, and
Hmm.
things don't go so well for him, frankly.
Yeah. It's interesting. I mean, I think you could say things didn't go well for him. That's absolutely true. I also think that his ambition for his family was ultimately successful. And I think that you can tie that back to his time in the UK. Absolutely. So you're right, 100%. I'm not going to say that he was a fantastic ambassador. That is not true. But I do think that he accomplished some of the goals in terms of pushing his family up the social ladder.
And he was so wrong about World War II and about Hitler. And his
Yeah.
son, well, the second son, turned out
Hmm.
to be very much correct.
Hmm.
JFK writes why England slept.
Hmm.
How did you, um, in your view, is that sort of the beginning of the family's climb up the ladder?
Absolutely. Absolutely. That I think it's interesting because, you know, originally kind of the idea, the plan was for that JFK's older brother Joe to be the politician in the family. And he passed away during World War II, whereas JFK was a war hero. I think that is part of it. I think him being a war hero, him kind of seeing that he needs to prove that he did not agree with his father and kind of take that stand. And he knew he needed to serve if he wanted a future in politics and things like that. I think that was the beginning right there.
What did the royals think of the Kennedys? Do we know?
Yeah, absolutely. Of Joe and
Yeah,
and Rose.
of that group of Kennedys. Yeah, we know
Yeah,
the later ones, but of that original group of Kennedys, who are these people coming to England?
absolutely. I mean, I think they were of two minds. One, they thought, who are these people who don't know what they're doing? They're sending an kind of an Irish American ambassador to the UK. They're already going to be an outsider. Joe Kennedy didn't necessarily want to follow all the protocol and the rules of going to court and things like that. He's there. It's this huge family that's here, and that was true. But at the same time, the younger generation absolutely loved Kick, loved JFK's sister Kick. She enthralled them. She was very American, boisterous, but they loved her. And at the same time, whether or not they thought, okay, maybe he's a bit uncouth, they knew that the UK was kind of on the brink of war and that they needed to impress these people. They needed to be kind to these people. They needed to involve them in social life because they knew that America was going to be a key ally.
I was stunned to read that Jackie was at Queen Elizabeth's coronation. I may have read it at one point, but I forgot that. How did she wind up there? And she's not, of course, with the Kennedys yet.
Right. So that was when she was, a young Jacqueline Bouvier. So she was a reporter at the Washington Times Herald. And again, prior to even her engagement to JFK. And so she was sent on assignment. She covered what was called the Coronation Crossing, this kind of boat of Americans going over to England for Queen Elizabeth's coronation. So she covered that in her column, which was called Inquiring Camera Girl. She wrote a number of features about both that boat ride, but then when she got to the UK, kind of what life was like with the crowds of people and going to kind of see all of the excitement and kind of overhearing people who were so excited about the coronation.
Do we know whether she was attracted to that type of lifestyle of all the attention?
Absolutely. So well, was she attracted to that type of lifestyle? I think she was very interested in monarchy. Like she was not a monarchist, but she was kind of enthralled by the pomp and pageantry of it all. I find her I find her writings during that time to be so interesting because she they offer a portrait of someone before she was famous. And so she she spoke more freely. She was very funny and curious and a little bit snarky. And kind of you see that fade away as she comes into the public eye. So I think it's a really interesting portrait of Jackie and kind of the truest self. I do think people are often kind of their truest selves when they're young, and then they kind of chip away at that. And I think that was the case for Jackie, certainly. And um, you know, one of the people she interviews talks about kind of like, oh, I don't know if I would like life in a fishbowl. And I think that's just like so interesting that Jackie was like having those conversations about fame before she was famous.
I'm trying to go a little bit chronologically here.
Sure.
Then you have the assassination of John F. Kennedy. What do we know about how the Windsors react to this horrible and traumatic event for everybody? I want to say everybody, but most people around the world.
Yeah, I think they reacted like most people. I think they were absolutely shocked and horrified, and one immediately were like sent off messages to Jackie, and also, sent a more formal message to President Johnson, because part of, you know, that is continuing the relationship between the United States and the United Kingdom. That's part of Queen Elizabeth's job. Um, but, they immediately knew that they wanted to send a representative, not just from the government, but from the royal family to attend the funeral services. Queen Elizabeth was very pregnant at that time, with Prince Edward, her fourth child. And so it was kind of deemed that that wouldn't work, that she couldn't go. And so Prince Philip, immediately kind of stepped in there, and he served as the family's representative, at the funeral.
He winds up having a pretty intimate moment with one of the youngsters as this traumatic event for these kids is unfolding.
Absolutely. So, Jackie said there were only a handful of people that she wanted kind of to meet with personally. Well, to take a step back, so following the burial, Jackie kind of had to play hostess one last time at the White House, for all of these diplomats. Like, absolutely, it was a tragedy, a funeral. She was grieving her husband, but this was still a diplomatic moment. This was the this was one of the largest gatherings of foreign diplomats on American soil in history, which is kind of remarkable. And so, protocol was essential, and hosting all of these people was essential, and making sure that everyone felt taken care of was critical. And a lot of that fell to Jackie. Um, but she said, there were only a handful of people that she wanted kind of upstairs and kind of having more intimate conversations with. And one of those was Prince Philip, which I think says a lot. And, while he was there, he kind of came upon a young John F. Kennedy Jr., who was only 3 years old at the time. And he started playing with him. And kind of keeping him occupied, and Jackie kind of stumbled upon this scene. And I just think that, was such a moment of humanity. This was not a moment for protocol or anything like that. This was, Prince Philip kind of comforting a young boy who had just lost his father.
How did their relationship change and evolve as they moved past John F. Kennedy and go into the 70s and 80s? And Diana um, is going to be growing up, and the Kennedy children are growing up. How do those stories intertwine as these younger people come of age?
Yeah, I think it's interesting that so Diana, well, to move a little bit further, kind of into the 90s, Diana saw Jackie as a real role model. She thought that Jackie did a fantastic job with raising her children in the public eye, and that was something that Diana was at the forefront of her mind constantly. And she thought that Jackie's path was the right one in trying to shield them, which I find so interesting. I think that I'm trying to think of I think that the kind of comparison between Diana and Jackie is a fascinating one. I think that they both are two women who, um, they were in the public eye. They both had their ways of kind of working with the media, but at the same time, they were hounded by them. I think they're just like an interesting kind of parallel to look at.
Diana and JFK Jr. Was it a date?
No, it wasn't. Many people say it was, but it wasn't. I talked with Patrick Jeffson, who
That was just a
um,
question. I was just asking.
I think there are a lot of people who would have liked it to be. I think that
Right,
the
right.
idea of kind of, royalty marrying royalty or what have you, American and British. This was at the time when she was separated from then Prince Charles. When she met with JFK in New York City at JFK Jr. rather, in New York City at the Carlisle Hotel. And yes, there's been plenty of speculation. But I spoke with Patrick Jeffson, who was Princess Diana's private secretary at the time, and he was in the room, and he essentially said no funny business um, occurred. I was there, which I just found funny. But no, he was John F. Kennedy Jr. Was interested in asking Diana to be on the cover of his magazine, George Magazine. He thought that, you know, she represented kind of the intersection of politics and celebrity in a way that would be very intriguing to her readers. I think it was not lost on him that it would sell copies if Diana was on the cover, and he was kind of mindful in that way.
What's the current state of their family relationship and what's the future of it?
Yeah. It's just a few weeks ago at this point, King Charles was in the United States for, the state visit, and he after his time in DC, he went to New York City and he had an event at the King's Trust, which is one of his kind of organizations that helps with helps, you know, youth find employment. And it's something that he's been passionate for many years. And this is an anniversary year. And at that gala in New York City was Caroline Kennedy. The story kind of continues on. There is a relationship there. I think the Earthshot Prize that I mentioned previously, Prince William's environmental initiative that continues to have a relationship with the John F. Kennedy Library Foundation. Things are still ongoing. So there is certainly a relationship there. But at the same time, I found it really interesting that Jack Schlossberg, who is the only grandson of President Kennedy, the son of Caroline Kennedy, he's running for Congress in New York's 12th district. And, you know, in one of his early interviews after announcing his campaign, he said something to the effect of, I don't like it when my family is compared to royalty. He doesn't like the kind of, the American royal family moniker. And I just thought that was kind of interesting. And maybe that's like a representative of kind of the path forward in terms of politics. And, the idea of an American dynasty is falling out of fashion.
You, you, Caroline, get to go back to the beginning. You get to be born into one of
Mm.
two families on the whole planet. You get to be born into the Kennedy family or the Windsor family.
Oh,
Which do you think is safer and more wholesome for a child to grow up in?
I think I have to say the Kennedys because the Kennedy family at this point is so large. There are so many people. Um, you know, I have been to the John F. Kennedy Museum on Hyannis on Cape Cod. And there is one wall in the exhibit that is the family tree, and it takes up a whole wall. It starts with Joe and Rose at the top, and then it's their kids and then their descendants. And so it is possible to be a member of the Kennedy family and live a very normal life. Unless, like I said, so you can get your wedding in People magazine, and if something really bad happens to you, that is going to make national news. But otherwise, you can live a private life.
Each family has dealt with, unfortunately, their share of tragedies. How do you compare and contrast the way they react to them, um, either in a private or in a public way?
I think there's a strong comparison here. I think that when I was initially writing this book, I first thought of the times in which these families met, and then I thought about the parallels and compared and contrast them in a big way. And one of the first things that came to mind was the idea of public grief and how both families have had a lot of tragedy, and they have to perform that grief. And just I can't wrap my head around how difficult that must be. And one of John F. Kennedy Jr.'s good friends told me, he didn't remember JFK's funeral. He doesn't remember that salute as a young boy. He had just turned 3 years old. But he did remember his mother's funeral and kind of the hordes of people kind of wanting comment from him and his sister, and him having to perform grief um without he had to perform it before he could kind of deal with it privately, and that was such a hardship for him. And Prince Harry has spoken a lot about this as well, of like how he had to perform grief following his mother's death, and that he didn't understand, and that he didn't necessarily realize kind of why other people were so upset they didn't know her. And I think that parasocial relationship is kind of one of the strongest between the two families.
I want to ask about the very difficult situation with Prince Harry and Meghan Markle.
Mm,
There was this admission that they made that somebody in the royal family, and it seemed like a pretty big somebody, married the wrong type of girl. And we all
mm.
know what he was referring to. Harry would never say who didn't approve. How close to the bottom of that could you get?
I wasn't really digging into that necessarily. I
Yeah.
think I think what was really interesting is I went back in my research. So I had covered the famous Oprah interview live. Um, when that aired on TV, that was a huge story for us at Town and Country. And we wrote, I don't know, 25 stories that night,
Yeah.
something
And
like that.
I'm not a royal guy either. I'm not
Yeah.
into it, but
Yeah.
I was all over that
Yeah, it
interview.
was a
Yeah.
huge story. It was a huge story. And I went back and I watched it again a couple times over the course of my research. And I hadn't remembered everything that they said, because there were a handful of real bombshells that dropped out. But the whole time I was listening to Megan talk, and she very bravely said, in essence, that she thought about killing herself. And everything that's come since then, you think back to that, and it's like she had a very difficult time in the royal family. And Harry, it seems like it got to the point where they said, we can't handle this. We need to get out of here. And that's what they did. And I think that
Is there a parallel to that anywhere else in their family? Has anyone else ever said, I'm out of here?
I not in the same way. I mean,
Yeah.
King Edward the Eighth and Wallace Simpson choosing to abdicate, that's certainly one. That's another very extreme example of saying, I'm out of here. If you aren't interested in kind of, if we can't have this relationship, I'm gonna leave. I think there is a parallel there. Um, but I think it brings to light an interesting comparison between these two families. It's very difficult to join these two families. And I think that if you think, there was a lot of kind of conversation about, Meghan said she had never Googled Prince Harry, and people like said that's a crazy thing to say. Like, what, like you would Google anyone you would date. Like, what do you
Right.
mean?
Right. Right.
And I think whether or not that's true, I think it gets to the point of, you can Google him all you want. You can research and learn and look into this. She would not have known what it was going to be like for her to join the royal family until she was in it. And that is exactly what Carolyn Bessette's friends said about her as well, that she joined the Kennedy family. She didn't know what to expect.
What can we take away from these stories and bring into our own lives to improve our own families?
Mm. One thing that I think I keep coming back to about these two families is that they are people who have enormous power and privilege and should be responsible with that, should be held accountable for things that they've done, should use that privilege to shine a spotlight on people who are less fortunate, all of that. But at the end of the day, they're still people. And I think that that is important to keep in mind in our modern kind of like celebrity culture, is that no one is above reproach and no one should be put on a pedestal so high that you're obsessed with them. Like these are people and these are families, and I think that that is um what I came out of researching this is I felt that even more strongly than when I went in. And but in terms of kind of what else to take away from these two families, I think that, yeah, I
I mean,
think
I think it's important. I mean, I think what you're saying is important, that you have to realize if you've got a little extra or a certain platform that it should be used responsibly, right?
absolutely,
Drink
absolutely.
responsibly. Your dedication. I love asking about dedications in
Mm,
books. Yours is "For My Family." I love you so much.
yeah.
That's self-explanatory there. I hope. What does a family give up when someone decides that they're going to write a book?
Mm. Ask my husband. No, a lot. Like I said, so I signed my book. I signed the contract to write this book when I was a couple months pregnant with my first child, which I would not recommend. I would not recommend doing that. We got here and we got here through, it takes a village to raise a child. In some ways, it takes a village to write a book. Um, and I have had a lot of help from many people. And it's not only is it taking my child, like my husband, watching my child so I can do research and I can write, or I can go to London to study at Kew or things like that. That's kind of the very basic thing. It's also he's been living with this story now for 5 years as well. I'm sure he's like, can we move on to talking about something else? But he's my first editor. He's looked at everything. So I mean, I would say family is so important in having a support system to be able to do something like this.
Have you decided as to whether you'll be doing another book?
I think so. I think I'd like to take a break for a minute,
Yeah.
but I like it. It's interesting because my entire kind of day career has been in digital journalism, and this is the exact opposite of that. And has been a really great challenge. It's been so interesting to online. You can have as long as you want to write about something, and being
Right.
able to kind of say, okay, you only have like this many
Yeah.
pages
We
to
can only sell this much paper for you.
exactly has been a great challenge. I've loved it.
Nice. Have you decided a topic next or no? I don't want to keep
No,
digging
not
here, but
not yet, not yet. I mean, I think I think I continue to be fascinated by other aspects of the Kennedys. I'll say that. I don't know if that will go anywhere, but I think they continue to be. I think this isn't what my future book is. I think Jackie Kennedy is one of the most fascinating people of the past 100 years. I could talk about her and write about her forever because I find her endlessly fascinating.
all right. Caroline Hallemann, the author of The Kennedys and the Windsors, the story of two dynasties, one born, one made. Thanks so much for being here.
Thank you, Evan. I appreciate it.
Check out the book and also her website, carolinehallemann.com. Axelbankhistory.com is designed by Nikki Rideout of Ellie Claire Designs. It has our most recent episodes, our featured episodes, and a link to that Patreon page. So check out Nikki's work and go to our Patreon page to keep the show going, and also to support our contributions for a charity for children's literacy. We do that every year, and we're about to do it again this year. Thank you for listening to Axelbank Reports, History and Today, conversations with America's top nonfiction authors and why their books matter right now. Check us out on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram, always at Axelbank History. We'll see you next time. Thanks.